Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Chris Robbins.
I'm Hannah Broderroot.
And I am Luke Freeman, and we are really glad that you're joining us today. We are kicking off our new month. Our topic for this month is survival strategies. And just as a reminder, before we jump into this, you can download the reflection guide as we go through this month at magicintheroom.com. There's a free reflection guide. We really encourage folks to go there, download that. You can follow along, spend some time this month thinking through, as we'll discuss today, what are some survival strategies that impact your leadership, how you show up, how you make decisions. And before we jump into this topic for this episode and for this month, I just want to say, we're going to be talking about some challenging things because, long story short, we all get our survival strategies that we use, that we incorporate, that are the tools in our tool chest of the behaviors we use in different situations. We get them honestly. We get them from life experience that for whatever reason, things that we've done that have been helpful to us in the past, we end up applying in our day-to-day leadership behaviors. And sometimes the lessons that we've learned have been really difficult, up to and including really traumatic experiences. So today, and as we go through this month, if we start talking about things that feel challenging for you and cause you harm, things like abuse, neglect, or other trauma, just know that that's going to be a little bit of the part of the conversations. We are not licensed therapists. We are organizational psychologists. And so we want to be helpful here, but also recognize that there could definitely be a place where you might want to reach out to a professional to help you think through or talk through anything that comes up. So just wanted to give that warning. So let's jump in.
And I want to, just to put this in context, we are talking about intentional leadership this season. And so the reason we're talking about survival strategies, it's really about how we manage stressful situations, right? Or how we help our teams and our organizations manage through stress and pressure in a helpful way. So when we say survival strategies, we're going to dive into what that means, but also how that applies very practically in managing stress.
Yep, great. So let's jump into it. So when we say survival strategies, what do we mean? What is a survival strategy? And let's just start with the goal of our brain. Hannah, do you want to walk us through, what is our brain trying to do as we navigate life and challenging situations?
Yeah, so the number one first goal of our brain is to help us survive. So that means to keep us safe and to avoid harm. And the way that translates in the brain is that anything that we experience as a threat, so that could be a physical threat to our literal survival or a psychological threat, because the brain doesn't really differentiate between those, right? It does not know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger chasing us or feeling excluded in a team environment or in a social situation. They register as a threat or they register as pain. So the brain's goal is to avoid pain, avoid harm, and keep us safe. So if we keep that in mind, that's always really what it's about. It's our brain trying to keep us safe. And sometimes it does that in a helpful way. And sometimes there are unhelpful ways, right? But like Luke mentioned, we came by it honestly because we've all had experiences that have been difficult. We've all experienced some level of trauma, whether it's physical trauma with an injury or psychological trauma. which can take lots of different forms and different levels. We learned how to survive through that, right? However, as productive leaders, members of society, members of a team, we want to not only survive, we want to thrive. So we'll talk about some more of how we can do that today.
Let's talk about types of stress. And when we say types of stress, really thinking like severity of stress, because our brain is going to encode survival strategies based on how severe that stress was that we had to survive, right? So if I've never experienced really extreme stress and I really have just been thinking about what's my performance strategy, I might be able to be more adaptable. On the other hand, if I've had to take some extreme strategies to really be able to survive extreme stress, it might be very hard to convince my brain to try something different. So Hannah, do you want to kind of walk us through different types of stress? What do we mean when we talk about levels of stress?
Yeah, so let's start with what we could call positive stress, right? And I want to also just put this out here. Some kind of stress, pressure is necessary for any organism to grow, right? So there's some level of stress or resistance that we need in order to grow, to flourish, to perform better, right? If we just think about even strength training, right? If we are not stressing that muscle, it is not going to repair itself and grow. We could also call that, we've talked about anti-fragility in the podcast before, right? Systems that are devoid of any kind of stress become fragile. And so, yeah, there is some kind of positive stress that's really helpful for growth, and they are normal, they're healthy. What identifies positive stress is that it's typically kind of a brief episode of stress, like, training that muscle, right? We're really tearing muscle fiber when we're lifting weights, and we need that time for that muscle to recover, right? So we can't constantly stress the muscle, then it's going to not be helpful, right? But we stress the muscle for a little while, we give it a period of healing, it gets stronger, right? So other situations that could be determined as positive stress are things like new situations, going through transitions, minor life changes, some unexpected events that cause us to have to recalibrate, right? Or we move from one kind of corporate setting to another type of business environment where the rules that we thought we were playing by no longer apply. And that's a level of stress, and that can be positive because it helps us learn and grow.
I like that example because it makes me think of a promotion as a great example of positive stress, right? So something that we would consider a positive thing in our life or in our career is also causing us to look at relationships differently, to look at dynamics differently, to be more aware. Like, we've all gone into that job on the first day, right? Could just be getting a new job. Really positive thing. We can be excited about it, but also our alert system is a little higher than it would be if we were just in the status quo day to day. And so I love your description there of positive stressors as being normal and healthy.
Yeah. All right. So then there's what we would call tolerable stress. This is a little bit more serious kind of stress, right? Now it's activating our body's alert system, and our body's like, well, what's going on? Or we get, maybe this is something that might trigger our fight or flight response to some extent, where there's some kind of more severe stress, but it is tolerable enough that both our mind and our body can recover from that, right? Examples of that could be moving. I'm coming up on a move and I'm definitely feeling some level of stress about it. And I haven't gotten too far into the process, but I've moved before. And in the middle of it, it can feel really stressful, really overwhelming. I also know that it has an end, right? So at some point, I'm going to be done moving. I'll be in the new place and things will start to normalize. It has an end point. I can see the end. It's not something where I feel just like hopelessly lost in this place of limbo forever and ever. Divorce can be a really tolerable, like it can feel extremely disruptive, even depending on the circumstances, traumatic at times, right? And depending on, the circumstances, again, this can span all of the levels of stress. But again, it's something that comes to an end at some point. Life normalizes. You move on with your life. Natural disasters also can be really traumatic, but they have an endpoint. Losing a job can be extremely stressful, can feel even traumatic, right? Again, because we tend to be resilient. We tend to, we find a new job, life moves on, and it is something that we can recover from. So all of these tolerable stressors, and tolerable is a little bit of a tricky word because any of these do not feel tolerable in the moment, right? They really can trigger our survival strategies in terms of, and we'll define these a little more clearly, but the fight, flight, freeze, or appease, right? The reactive mode, we're reacting to this disruption. But it's tolerable because it doesn't last forever. It ends, we get through it, and we move on.
Yeah, I'm curious, Hannah. I'm going to put you on the spot here since you mentioned moving. I know we've talked about that a lot just in day-to-day life as you prepare for this move. But what survival strategies do you see kind of like coming up to the surface for you? And how do you kind of think about which of those are helpful and which of them aren't helpful in this period of tolerable stress?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question, right? Because what happens when we're faced with a stressor that is relatively serious stressor, it triggers that survival mechanism, which is trying to deal with the pain because the brain experiences it as pain, right? So for me, my default reaction is flight in this particular instance, right? I don't want to think about it. I don't want to deal with it. It feels overwhelming. I want to get away from this whole experience, right? So if we think of fight, flight, freeze, or appease, they're ways that our brain gets triggered in a stressful event. And those are reactions, right? We all have reactions, and it's okay to have reactions. What's helpful is when we catch ourselves in that reaction, and we create this moment, create a pause where we can actually recognize that we have a choice, right? We've been talking about notice, choose, and act as our model for leadership. So when I notice that I'm in flight mode, that I'm trying to avoid this whole situation, that this move is imminent, I can reel myself back in. I can recognize that I have a different choice, and I can make an intentional response. So for me, that might mean taking a moment, thinking through what do I actually have to do, making a list, creating maybe an action plan, right? And engaging my thinking brain rather than the emotional reactive brain.
Yeah. But I think that really kind of scratches at the role of mindfulness in coping.
Yeah.
Right. I'm wired to respond a certain way based on my experiences, based on what I value, based on what I believe. I'm going to have this wiring to respond. I think we've got to ask ourselves, do I need to be right based on what I value and believe, or do I need to be effective based on the situation that I'm facing? So in that, I think it can be helpful to bring in some level of stoicism around expectations. Okay, what's the source of most conflict? Unmet expectations. I have expectations about how today's going to go, or how this meeting's going to go, or that at the end of the day, regardless of what I expect to happen, there are a lot of things that move us forward. I'll use an example from this week. We're faced with a process mapping exercise with a client partner, and in my mind, there are three possible outcomes. We have the agenda, we know what we're trying to accomplish, and we accomplish exactly that. Okay? Win. That's a win. We have the agenda, we try to accomplish the outcomes, but we don't quite get through it all. We still move things forward. We run into conflict, right, between a facilitator and a client partner, and everything goes to hell in a handbasket, and we don't accomplish anything that was on the agenda. Well, guess what? We still learned, right? We have an opportunity to improve, even when we don't get to the outcomes, but it comes from the expectation, right? The expectation, our goal is to set the agenda and get ultimately all the outcomes, but other things that are short of that are still forward. But if I paint the narrative, or I choose and have an expectation that that's the only win is doing all the things, the only win is accomplishing what I believe is right, then I'm setting myself up to have to deal with a lot more stress. So if I bring an element of stoicism, we can all have, I think, grace as a form of honor, and say, it's okay if we leave without all the stuff done, if the relationships have been forged and we're better than we were when we started. That's the outcome. Now, is that fast enough for everybody? Maybe not, but it paints that relationship and that work community in a different light, and that's our expectation. So I'm interested, and I think a lot of this can be seeded with forms of honor. Grace as a form of honor, gratitude as a form of honor, having a shared understanding that this is always going to be hard. Life is always going to be hard. I've been doing it almost 48 years. It's been hard for 48 years. But it's that appropriate pressure, it's the appropriate stress that drives us to move forward and grow and learn how to cope in more effective ways, and not try to stick with only what I know. Right? I don't need to be right. The leader's job is to be effective. And when we can use gratitude as a form of honor, be grateful for the time, the opportunity to do the work that we do, the gift of today, and the gift of space together. I think when we have that gratitude, it can help keep us safe.
Yeah.
So when we think about, things that are toxic, I think one of the things we can do to alleviate or lessen the likelihood that we find ourselves in toxic positions is to have that gratitude be properly oriented to what I'm trying to accomplish today. And that's where purpose plays a role in this, right? If I get up every day, orient to the fact I'm here to help other leaders achieve their vision of success, and I know where I stand spiritually, and I know what I believe, and I know it's not about me. When I'm properly oriented, I'm a lot less likely to find myself in positions where toxic stress is involved.
Yeah. And I think what you have touched on, Chris, are things that build resilience, right? And so some levels of stress, pressure on a system helps to build resilience, as long as there's that, whether it's the recovery period, the active practice of gratitude, the active practice of mindfully paying attention and being able to choose our responses, right? And I think mindfulness and gratitude in particular are especially helpful tools to turn stress into growth and to turn circumstances that could be adverse and have adverse effects on us into resilience building activities, right? So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, and what the research would say is that we'll get to types of toxic stress in a moment. What the research would say is that connection to community is really the largest mediating factor between if those tolerable, disruptive stressors really become toxic for our brains and for our bodies. And so, yes, those practices can help, Chris, I would say, but I would also say, like, add on to that, do we have meaningful relationship and a support system around us? And oftentimes, anchoring to gratitude comes as a reminder from someone who reminds us that, like, let's pause and be in the moment and reflect on the positive things around us. Or, hey, today was really hard. I've got your back. Let's go grab a coffee together. So yeah, the research is pretty clear that community mitigates the risk of those disruptive, tolerable stressors becoming toxic. But Hannah, like, sometimes that doesn't always happen and people experience toxic stress. And this is kind of where we get into trauma with a big T. So you want to talk about, like, what is toxic stress?
Yeah, so here's, the trigger warning Luke shared at the beginning, right? So these are those types of strong, frequent, or long-lasting difficulties. So everything we've described so far are things that come to an end, right? They are things that we can move past. When we're in a situation where we feel like there is no way out of ongoing, constant pain, it can have pretty severe long-term effects on both of our brain and our body, right? So those are things like abuse, being in an abusive relationship or experiencing childhood abuse where you have no control in the situation, where if there's neglect. So these are some things that cause pretty severe trauma. And if we don't have a way to escape or get out of the situation, it can become harmful, right? Does it mean that we're doomed if we've experienced those things? No, absolutely not, because our bodies and our minds, the way we're created is we're made for resilience, and we are incredibly resilient creatures, but it will take a lot more very intentional, directed healing to recover from those types of experiences. And so, yeah, there are a lot of people, maybe in our own organizations, right, that may have been experiencing toxic stress today, this week, this year, and we don't always know, right? So I think being really careful when we address those things with people, I think is important, because when we see people having maybe reactions that we don't understand, let's just pause there and recognize that we don't understand why they're reacting the way they're reacting, and, thinking about, handle with care if we experience types of, if we have an inkling that someone may have experienced that type of stress, right, be extremely careful. Chris?
Yeah, I think it's important to say there is a reason why that person's showing up that way. And the last thing that person needs is our judgment. And so when I say it's about being effective, it's not about being right. It's in exactly that moment where someone else's behavior is not helpful is not helpful to the situation we're trying to advance. They're working against what we're trying to achieve. But the last thing I need to do is judge that person. And the first thing I need to do is say, I wonder why they're showing up this way. And they probably need my care a lot more than they need my judgment. And that is, to me, that's what, like, being in a work community, living in service to other people, that is a requirement. Now, I'm not saying I'm always great at it. Okay, so let's not get that twisted. Like, I fail at this as well. But when I'm at my best, I can say this individual behavior is not helpful to the situation we are trying to advance. Why are they showing up this way? And me as a leader, whether it's titled, whether it's hierarchical, doesn't matter, whether I'm a direct report, right? I want to find out why, and I want to extend care and see if we can't break through whatever that is.
Yeah. And to, just to clarify a little bit more, even things like household dysfunction, there are different things that we've grown up with, right, that can have that kind of toxic effect. Mental illness is another one that can be both a cause and effect of toxic stress, right? It can be an outcome of experiencing toxic stress, but it can also cause toxic stress. And so, Chris, what you called out, how do we respond to a person that is showing up in a way where their reaction we may not understand, giving care rather than judgment, I think is a big key. And I want to flip that around. If that person is us, same thing applies. Respond with care rather than judgment. And we'll share some specific methods for how we can cope with any kind of level of stress. But to Luke's point earlier, if you've been someone who has experienced a level of toxic stress over time and it's having effect, there are professionals who are trained to, help you heal from that. And I would encourage looking for those resources. And if you're a leader who have people in your organization that have experienced that type of stress, share resources, right? Help that person get professional help.
Yeah. So we've covered types of stress. There's positive stress, that's normal, part of daily life, moves us forward. There's tolerable stressors, which are more difficult, disruptive, but we can move through them, and especially with community, deal with those. And there's toxic stressors that might leave a lasting impact on our minds and bodies. So let's move to, we can categorize how we respond to that stress, the survival strategies that we've used. So remember that our brain is always trying to keep us safe. It's trying to get us things we need: food, shelter, safety, meaningful relationships, and it's trying to avoid pain and harm. And so as we've faced stress growing up in our life, in our first jobs, we develop strategies to respond to stress, to get the things we need and to avoid pain and the things that we don't need. And let's just run through, there's some general categories of these. Hannah mentioned them earlier: fight, flight, freeze, appease. So let's run through those real quickly. And let's start with fight. So what does it mean if someone responds to stress, if their primary survival strategy is to fight?
Yeah, it's all about confronting the threat, because again, the brain is experiencing the situation as a threat, right? And I do think this can be situational, not necessarily that we're always applying the same strategy. And I also like to clarify the word strategy, because strategy sounds very thought out, right? And in this context, when we say strategies, really the strategies that the brain has adopted that we may or may not have had direct thoughtful impact on, right? So I like to think of them as reactions versus responses, right?
Yeah, but I want to make a point there that they can be complex, right? The fact that they're automatic and reactive doesn't mean that they're not complex strategies. And so, I'm going to have a quick nerdy example here. So there's Diana monkeys in South America that have a word for different predators. And there's an awesome story out there about a guy who was studying these Diana monkeys, hiking through the jungle, and he heard the word for jaguar, these monkeys' word for jaguar, about 100 yards behind him on this trail. And as he walked, the different troops of monkeys would yell out, hey, jaguar, and they're talking to each other because he knew their language and their response to that stress. Like, he could tell that the jaguar was gaining on him as he went down this trail. So that's just kind of a brief example of like the Diana monkeys develop language and pass that language on as a response to that stressor through generations. They have created specific language and response to that threat. And we do the same things, whether it's through our household, through our personalities, we can develop pretty complex responses. And when I think about fighting, to get back to fighting, like, I'm a fighter. That's usually my instinctual response to stress. That's my go-to survival strategy. And it can look pretty complex sometimes. It doesn't look like me getting in an argument with someone. It might look like me socially architecting, having influence when I feel like I'm vulnerable. So if I'm in an organization and I feel like things aren't going the way I want to, and I don't like it, and it's stressful, and it's not aligned with my values, I will probably become active. And again, you said the goal is to confront the threat and to overpower and gain control. I might have some pretty sophisticated means of doing that, gaining control and overpowering, and they could take months, right? But they're just my natural reaction. And if I don't curb it, I can become someone who is always trying to gain an advantage so I can be secure and have control. Yeah. So it can look really complicated, or it can look like, hey, we want to buy a car. So what am I going to do? Like, I want to buy a car. I need like $5,000 more dollars. Okay, I'm just going to work really hard and earn that in the next 2 weeks. And I just of course, my response is sleep less, work more, grind it out. Like, that's another fight strategy to a stressor. So these can look a lot of different ways, and they can be complex. And I think that's why therapists have really booming business, right? There's layers and layers and layers of these strategies that are built into our psyches.
Yeah. And I think something you touched on, Luke, is helpful for the context here, right? Each of these strategies has a specific goal. And that's why, some of us have maybe we all have a preferred or default mode. I find for me, it's completely contextual, right? Whether I whether I become the fighter, whether I, in the moving situation, I just want to avoid it. My instinct is not to fight and engage with that because I don't even want it to be happening, right? So my brain is trying to avoid it. And I have to actively fight against that, right? I have to apply some fight in that. Otherwise, I'm just going to, be a fire festival that completely implodes, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Hannah, because I was thinking about that. So Hannah and I were both in Montana all last week, where Hannah lives, and I was staying with you and your partner at your house, and you guys were talking about moving and finding a place to go to. And I was I felt some of that stress. So I felt this urge that I resisted to go scroll Zillow and find the solution. And that's my fighter response coming out. There's a problem. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to solve it. Right. And it's so interesting to even think about wanting to avoid it, because I'm just fight so strong.
Luke, kind of touching on that stress response right there, you're feeling it, and it's okay, I'm going to my wiring and I'm just going to do how I cope. I'm going to help cope with you that same way. When I heard something really powerful that I want to share, it was relational. When someone comes to us in a stress type of situation, this question of, and I don't know if we can ask this explicitly without having the duck, but like when someone comes to us in a stressful situation, maybe it's a partner, maybe it's a partner in a relationship, maybe it's a partner in a business, whatever that might be, and they're like, here's the stress that I'm facing, here's my conflict. And this idea, and I want to communicate the idea, maybe not the words, but would you like comfort or would you like a solution? Or do you just need me to listen? Yeah. And I was like, whoa, okay. Like maybe, but it's just that snap to say, it's not about me. It's about figuring out what the person in the situation is really seeking. Or maybe it becomes a conversation. Like, as you think about this situation, is it something you're looking to action? Or is it something you're just trying to think through?
Yeah.
Is it something you'd like to share some ideas around? Or explore how we got here? Like, would some reflection be helpful? But that's, I don't know, it's just kind of the spirit of the question and how pointed that is, the bold thing, like, do you want comfort or do you want a solution?
And this has a doubly powerful effect, Chris, because anytime we ask a question of someone, even if that's ourselves, right, whether it's someone else or ourselves, when we find ourselves spinning out, we're reacting to whatever go-to survival strategy we're in. When we're asked a question, it triggers the thinking part of the brain to activate. And the brain can only do one thing effectively at a time, either we're thinking clearly or we're feeling strongly. So when we feel strongly, we are not thinking clearly. When we're thinking clearly, the emotional intensity is less, right? So if we find ourselves in this hyper emotional state where our survival strategy is triggered, and we find ourselves not able to get out of that. We're just spinning out, whatever that looks like for us, right? When someone asks us a question like that, it makes us start thinking, and it activates the prefrontal cortex, which means the amygdala, the back of the brain, the limbic system cools down. There's not as much reactivity. And you can see this on MRI scanners, right? When our thinking brain is activated. So the fact that I actually have to stop and think, what do I need in this moment, and provide an answer to that already takes us out of the reactive state, and it helps us activate a more helpful response, right? So I have to think through, what do I need in this moment? For me, it's always all of the above. First, listen, then comfort, then help me find a solution.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's a really powerful question with a great sentiment. And so I just want to bring us back. We've talked about fight here. We've also talked about flight. The main goal of flight is to avoid the threat, right? So that means maybe physically running away. And here's where it's situational, right? If you encounter a bear, do you want to fight? Or do you want to actually avoid that threat? Our dog had his first encounter with a bear recently, also the week that Luke was in Montana, and he took the bear on. He was not a fighter. He was not trying to run away. He tried to fight the bear, and that's pretty scary, right? It was a black bear, so he was able to effectively chase the bear away and keep the bear away from his people. That was his goal, right? But there are definitely situations depending on the size of the threat. And again, because the brain isn't really good at detecting what is a real threat versus what is a perceived threat, we may not always deploy the most helpful strategy.
Yeah, and I'm just going to give a little anecdote there. Used to work in ropes course world, zip lines and challenge course and all of that, and do team development using that tool. And there's a really interesting physiological kind of reality that we experience fear of heights the same about 11, 12 feet off the ground. It kicks in, and we experience that fear or anxiety the same if we're 11 or 12 feet off the ground as if we're 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet off the ground. And so our brains have been designed to understand where it's dangerous for us to be, where if we fall, we're probably going to get significantly injured. And participants can't control that. So if you're at a ropes course and you get someone 11, 12, 13 feet off the ground, you get the same impact, whether you're working on trust on the team that is belaying them or whatever it is, right? You get the same impact working through that physiological response to heights as if you're really, really high off the ground. So it goes into like how you even build a ropes course and build elements. But I love that example because just like our brains don't really logically know if we're clipped into a carabiner and rope, or if we're 15 feet off the ground versus 40 feet off the ground, because the consequences are probably still very life-altering if you fall. We also can't really control some of that physiological response in social settings that historically, if you go back and listen to our episode on kind of the inner caveman, psychologically, we experience lots of social isolation or not belonging to our group as a physical threat in the same way, and we can't control it. So anyway, a little aside, let's get through these last two. So the next one is to freeze. And freezing is really shutting down, trying to ignore the threat, trying to make yourself small. And the goal is to not be the focus of the threat. And we see this oftentimes when we come in and do an intervention with a team or with an organization. There will often be people who we have to really draw out and say, hey, you've been in this conference room talking with us for the last hour, but you haven't said anything. Like, what's your take on this? And there's a lot of folks who they've learned in that setting that if they just aren't noticed, they can avoid some of the pain that has to do with change or conflict or whatever else. So I'm curious, Chris and Hannah, other examples of freezing, or even times that could be a helpful strategy.
Yeah.
I'd go back to the bear example earlier, right? Not being the focus of the bear's attention is probably really helpful, right? So if we try to confront the bear, if it's a grizzly, we're probably not going to win. If we try to run away from the bear, it might trigger it to chase us, right? If we freeze, get quiet, then there's different, bear aware and how to react in a situation of a bear, right? But just like slowly backing away and trying to not make any sudden moves can be a helpful strategy. And so sometimes we get triggered into a freeze situation where it's not helpful too, right? Where we just kind of shut down and it becomes, it could become a detriment to the situation itself because we're not trying to help ourselves. So Chris, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to bring the appease into this conversation a little bit early, but I want to talk about how there's interplay, especially like interpersonally. Someone is telling me how I've wronged them. Okay, they are offended about a communication or an action or maybe a way that I go about life. And there is an offense here. And they are kind of projecting this stressor onto me because it's somehow a behavior that I have exhibited that's creating this emotion. Well, now I'm taking this stress on and I have to make a choice. I can fight and take the chance of harming that person, right? I can appease the situation but that's not helpful because I would be speaking untruths in order to appease that situation. So my values don't allow me to appease, and my values don't allow me to fight because of the harm it could create. But my values may allow me to freeze, because in that I avoid harming the other person through fight, and I avoid creating additional suffering through appeasement. But I can freeze in this spot and honor however that person feels, however they've been offended, let them communicate, say I understand, but not, try to limit the amount of harm that comes out of this situation by becoming small. So that's one way that I see that show up, right? Where maybe freezing is helpful. Right? If my values don't allow me to do the other three, maybe I can do that one. Whereas somebody else would say, hell, go back at them with all the ways they offend you and what you don't like that they do, right? Again, not helpful. Like if I'm trying to be effective, I might choose freeze as a stress response.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole point here. What we're, trying to do is create intentionality, right? Recognizing that, yes, we may, and so what you just described, Chris, that does take a whole lot of thinking and processing to be able to apply the right strategy, right? Now, we may be in the moment triggered into our default, which might be one of those who is not helpful in the situation, and noticing that is helpful. And then we can do that kind of assessment that you just shared, which I think is incredibly helpful. What is most helpful in this situation to be able to not make it worse, right? How do we contain the situation? How do we minimize the harm, or how do we make ourselves not the focus so that the situation escalates?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the other places I see this in freezing when it's not helpful is typically in those group settings, with like when we work with teams and you've got the person that has a ton of value, like their perspective like really unlocks the potential of the team, but they've experienced life in such a way that when they step out, right, there's vulnerability. And when they've been vulnerable previously, it hasn't worked out, but I think in my main communication around this is, if we tend to freeze in those team settings, or we think to ourselves, if we have this narrative in our head that if I say something, I'll be judged, right? Like somebody will think me, that's dumb, that's stupid, that guy's a wacko, like whatever. Like if I'm fearful of being judged, that's when people freeze. But everyone in that room takes a discount when we freeze in that environment. Like we need the values and the perspectives of every team member to show up as we're tackling issues, as we're moving things forward. And we have, I just encourage everyone to have the courage to share their perspective so that our work communities can operate at a premium instead of a discount.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the same goes for appease, which you already talked about it. But with appease the threat, the goal is to minimize the threat by agreeing or complying with them. So we essentially become actors and say, oh yeah, I totally agree. I'm on your team. Oh, you want to do that? Great, let's do it. But the goal is to minimize harm when there's a power differential. So we see appease come into play lots of times with maybe unhealthy power dynamics in an organization and people not being empowered to live in ways that align with their values. Now, if you take it to the extreme, you can see that in abusive relationships with people who feel like they don't have power, don't have the ability to make themselves safe. And so they go along with the abuser. And I would just say, abuse with a small a in organizations unfortunately happens all the time. And so for someone who finds himself, using appeasing as a strategy, is it always negative? No. I think if we intentionally say there's a power differential here where I can't affect what I need to affect, but I'm going to choose to go along in service of my own security or a larger goal I have, I don't know that it's a bad strategy. But I think with all of these, if we're aware of them, we can make intentional choice. If I'm aware that my drive to go surf Zillow and find a place for Hannah to live is just my fight response and inappropriate for me to try and solve someone else's problem, then I can resist it and say, no, I'm going to intentionally do something else. I'm happy to be here and be a supportive friend, right? I don't need to be the problem solver. But if I'm not aware that that's my survival strategy, it would probably be much more difficult for me to make that choice.
The self-awareness of that is helpful, right? When am I trying to use a strategy that is helpful? Just one call out on a piece, it can be a tricky one because we don't always, like Luke said, we're sometimes acting. So as a leader, when you have a lot of people who are yes people who seem to try to appease you all the time, it's helpful to pay attention to that because it does agreement and complying doesn't necessarily mean buy-in, that the person is actually on board, right? They may just be trying to appease you as the leader because they don't want to feel the discomfort that's going to happen if they are honest, right? And so that leads to a whole nother probably episode on psychological safety and, how to create the kind of environment where we feel safe to speak up and not have to appease. But I think that one is one that's sneaky and really tricky, and it can be helpful and unhelpful, just like all of them, right? But one to pay a special attention to within organizations.
Our responses, flight, fight, freeze, or appease, should be situational, they should be dynamic, and they should be strategic in order to increase our effectiveness. And I think that's how I'd kind of wrap the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's my takeaway as well, is the more tools that I have in my toolbox, the more effective I can be in fulfilling my purpose and my goals, regardless of the situation and the people that I'm dealing with. And if I find myself being able to pull those out and being familiar with using power, familiar with avoiding threat, familiar with not being noticed, familiar with giving away small wins so I can get the long-term big win. If I find those easy, comfortable in my hands, right? I've used the tool multiple times. I think that's a good place to be and a good goal. But it's not easy. And in our next episode, we are going to talk about how we address these. There is some science around how we can most helpfully deal with stressful situations on our teams, with coworkers, for our own leadership journey at work. It's called the 4 C's. And so I'm excited to dig into that with you all as we move forward. Hannah, any final takeaways from you?
Yeah, for me, the final takeaway really is about all of these strategies are available to us. We are not stuck in our default reaction mode. Pay attention, notice, what is my instinctual reaction versus is there a more helpful strategy or a helpful way to respond in this situation?
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in the conversation today. This can be a challenging topic, but stress is real. It's a normal part of life. And we all have learned survival strategies to move us through stress. So if you want to talk about it, if you want to learn more, if you want to reflect on survival strategies, again, you can go to that download at magicintheroom.com. And I think there's some helpful reflection questions there for you to help identify what's your go-to strategy and how do you build utility and get comfortable with different strategies. Chris, you want to read us out today?
You bet. Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Broderud, and Luke Freeman, produced by our great friend Ben West. Our social media management is handled by Emma Holland and Maggie King. Our theme music is by Evan Graham. Check out all of his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded remotely using the magic of the internet, and Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. Check us out at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and you can find all of our previous episodes at magicintheroom.com.